I never thought I'd have to choose between my financial security and my relationship with my brother. But when he stood in my living room, demanding I sign over my house to him because family helps family, I knew something had to change. The call I made that day didn't just protect my property, it transformed our entire family dynamic forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The day began like any other Thursday. I had just finished a marathon video conference with our Asia-Pacific clients, the kind that required me to be up at an ungodly hour, despite working from home. Stretching my cramped shoulders, I wandered into the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of coffee when my doorbell rang with unusual insistence. Through the peephole, I saw my younger brother Connor standing on my front porch, shifting impatiently from foot to foot. This was unusual. Connor rarely visited without texting first, and certainly not at 9:30 on a weekday morning when he should have been at work. My brother had always marched to the beat of his own drum, but his erratic employment history had become a family concern over the past few years. "Hey, what brings you by?" I asked, opening the door. "Everything okay?" Connor brushed past me without the usual hug or greeting, heading straight for my living room as if he owned the place. He was dressed in worn jeans and a wrinkled button-down that looked like it had been pulled from a laundry basket. His hair needed a cut, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "We need to talk, Olivia," he said, sitting heavily on my sofa. "It's important." I followed him, concern creeping into my thoughts. Had something happened with our parents? Was he ill? The tight set of his jaw suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" I offered, professional, habit kicking in. Always make people comfortable before difficult conversations. "I don't need hospitality," he said with an edge to his voice. "I need your help." I sat in the armchair across from him, noting how he surveyed my living room with an appraising eye. The house was my pride and joy, a charming craftsman bungalow I'd purchased 3 years ago after my divorce from Eric. It had required significant renovation, but I'd transformed it into a comfortable home that reflected my taste and personality. The morning light streamed through the stained glass window inserts I'd salvaged from an architectural salvage store, casting colorful patterns across the hardwood floors. "What's going on?" I asked. Connor leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Kira and I broke up." "Oh, Connor, I'm sorry," I said, genuinely concerned. They had been together for nearly 2 years, and despite some obvious compatibility issues, Kira had seemed to be a stabilizing influence on my brother's life. He waved off my sympathy. "The thing is, her name is on the lease of our apartment. She's keeping it, which means I have nowhere to live." Understanding dawned. "You need a place to stay for a while?" "Not exactly," he said, meeting my eyes, directly. "I need a place of my own." I nodded slowly, wondering where this was heading. "Well, the rental market is tough right now, but I could help you look." "I don't want to rent," he interrupted. "It's throwing money away. I need to build equity." "Buying is a big step," I said carefully. "Have you spoken with a mortgage broker? With interest rates where they are?" "I can't qualify for a mortgage right now," he cut in again, frustration evident in his voice. "My credit took a hit after that business venture last year, and my employment history is—" He made a vague gesture. "Complicated." I waited, sensing there was more. Connor had a habit of circling his point before landing on it, especially when he wanted something significant. He took a deep breath. "That's why I'm here. You have 2 properties." The statement hung in the air between us. It was technically true. After my divorce, I had kept our first home, a modest 2-bedroom condo across town, as part of the settlement. I'd lived there while renovating this house, and now rented it out. The rental income helped offset my mortgage on this place, creating a fragile but functional financial ecosystem. "Are you asking to rent the condo?" I asked, though something in his expression told me he had something else in mind. "No, Olivia. I'm asking you to give me the condo." I blinked, certain I had misheard. "Give you the condo? Or this house if you prefer. You could move back to the condo," he added, as if he were suggesting a minor inconvenience. The audacity of his request momentarily robbed me of speech. I had worked 60-hour weeks for years to afford my first home with Eric. After the divorce, I'd taken on consulting work in addition to my full-time position to manage 2 mortgages until the renovation was complete. The condo represented my financial security, my backup plan, my future retirement income. "Connor, I can't just give you a property," I finally managed. That's not how this works." His expression hardened. "Why not? You have 2 homes. I have none. You're financially stable. I'm struggling. Isn't family supposed to help family?" "Help, yes. But what you're asking for—" "What am I asking for, exactly?" he interrupted, voice rising. "For my successful sister to share a little of her good fortune with her brother? Mom and Dad helped you with the down payment on your first place. Did you forget that? They loaned me $15,000, which I repaid with interest," I clarified, "and I worked 2 jobs to save the rest." Connor stood up abruptly and began pacing my living room. "Of course, Saint Olivia, who does everything right. Perfect grades, perfect career, perfect life." The bitterness in his voice caught me off guard. "Some of us haven't had your advantages." "Advantages?" I repeated, incredulous. "Connor, we grew up in the same household. We had the same opportunities." "Did we? You were always the favorite, the responsible one, the achiever. Do you know what it's like growing up in that shadow? Having teachers constantly compare us? Why can't you be more like your sister?" But I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I understand that was difficult, but it doesn't mean I owe you a house." "It's not about owing," he insisted. "It's about helping. You don't even need the rental income. Your job pays more than enough." His statement revealed just how little he understood about my financial situation. The corporate marketing director title sounded impressive, but after taxes, my mortgage, property taxes, and the student loans I was still paying off, the rental income wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Not to mention the substantial emergency fund I'd established after learning the hard way during my divorce. That financial independence was non-negotiable. "Connor, I'm not giving you either property," I said firmly. "But I can help you find a place to rent, maybe even cover the security deposit until you get back on your feet." He stared at me as if I'd slapped him. "So, that's it? That's your idea of family support?" "It's a reasonable offer," I replied, working to keep my voice steady. "You need to understand that—" "No, you need to understand something," he cut me off, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "I've already told Mom and Dad about this." My stomach dropped. "Told them what exactly?" "That you're going to help me by letting me have the condo. They think it's a wonderful solution. Dad said it would be keeping property in the family." The triumphant look on his face made it clear he thought he had outmaneuvered me. "You told them I had agreed to this?" I clarified, feeling a familiar pressure building behind my eyes, the prelude to a stress headache I'd become all too familiar with during my divorce. "I told them we were discussing it," he said with a shrug. "But they're expecting you to do the right thing. They're having us over for dinner on Sunday to celebrate." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost laughable. Almost. "There's nothing to celebrate, Connor. I'm not giving you the condo or this house." His face darkened. "So you're choosing money over family. Nice, Olivia. Real nice." "That's not fair," I said quietly. There's a vast middle ground between giving you a free house and not supporting you. Save it, he snapped. I'll be sure to let Mom and Dad know exactly how their daughter refused to help her homeless brother. The threat was clear. He would paint me as the villain, the selfish sister who hoarded her resources while her brother suffered. It was a narrative that would play well with our parents, who had always been protective of Connor, making excuses for his missteps and bailing him out of financial troubles since his teenage years. I think you should leave, I said, standing up. We both need to cool down before we say something we'll regret. Oh, I won't regret telling the truth, he retorted, heading for the door. Just wait until Sunday. You'll change your tune when Mom starts crying about family sticking together. After he left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the stained glass, I sank back into my chair. The encounter had left me shaken, not just by the outrageous demand, but by the glimpse into Connor's perception of our relationship. Had he always resented me this way? Had I been blind to his feelings all these years? I picked up my phone, tempted to call our parents immediately to set the record straight. But what would I say? That their son was attempting to manipulate them and me? That would only deepen the rift Connor was trying to create. Instead, I called the one person who had always given me clear-eyed advice, someone who understood family dynamics and boundary setting better than anyone I knew. My former therapist, Dr. Abernathy, had helped me navigate the emotional minefield of my divorce 3 years ago, and although we'd concluded our regular sessions, she had encouraged me to reach out if I ever needed perspective. That call would change everything, though not in the way anyone, least of all Connor, could have anticipated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Abernathy's office, a familiar voice answered. Hi, Melissa. It's Olivia Reynolds. I was wondering if Dr. Abernathy might have any availability in the next few days. I'm dealing with a family situation that's escalated suddenly. Let me check her calendar, Olivia. Can you hold a moment? As I waited, I gazed around my living room, at the built-in bookshelves I'd restored myself, the window seat where I enjoyed my morning coffee, the family photos arranged carefully on the mantel. Among them was a picture of Connor and me at his college graduation, arms around each other, both smiling widely. It had been taken just 6 years ago, but it felt like it captured strangers from another lifetime. Olivia? You're in luck. Dr. Abernathy had a cancellation tomorrow morning at 10. Would that work for you? That would be perfect, Melissa. Thank you. Of course. She'll see you tomorrow. Take care. As I ended the call, I felt a weight lift slightly from my shoulders. I didn't yet know how to resolve the situation with Connor, but taking this step, reaching out for objective guidance rather than being swept along by family pressure, felt right. It was the first decisive action in what would become a transformative journey, not just for me, but for my entire family. The irony wasn't lost on me. Connor had come demanding a house, believing I had the power to solve his problems with a simple property transfer. Instead, I'd made a different kind of investment, in professional advice, in emotional clarity, in establishing boundaries that should have been set years ago. Little did I know then that this single phone call would set in motion events that would ultimately lead to genuine healing rather than the quick fix Connor sought. It would be a longer, harder road than simply signing over a deed, but it would lead us all to a destination far more valuable than any piece of real estate. My phone buzzed with a text. Connor, hope you're reconsidering. Mom's already planning where to put my furniture in the condo. I set the phone down without responding. Sunday dinner loomed just 3 days away, and I needed to be prepared for the emotional manipulation that would surely be on the menu. But for the first time in our adult relationship, I wasn't going to play my assigned role in the family drama. The script was about to change. Have you ever reached a breaking point where you realized that helping someone doesn't mean giving them whatever they demand? That moment when you understand that true support sometimes requires saying no, even when it makes you the villain in someone else's story. That's exactly where I found myself, standing in my living room, watching my brother walk away angry because I wouldn't give him a house, wondering if I was the unreasonable one. The journey that began that Thursday morning would challenge everything I thought I knew about family loyalty, personal boundaries, and what it really means to help someone you love. It would force me to confront patterns established in childhood, to disappoint people who mattered to me, and ultimately, to find a strength I didn't know I possessed. And it all started with a phone call, not the one Connor had manipulated, by involving our parents, but the one I chose to make myself. The appointment with Dr. Abernathy couldn't come soon enough. I spent a restless night replaying Connor's visit in my mind, questioning whether I was being unreasonable. By morning, my inbox contained 3 messages from my mother with increasingly transparent hints about family responsibility and sharing blessings. One included links to articles about the tax benefits of gifting property to family members. As I settled into the familiar armchair in Dr. Abernathy's office, the tension I'd been carrying since Connor's visit began to ease slightly. The space hadn't changed in the years since my last visit. Still the same soothing blue walls, the watercolor landscapes, the subtle scent of lavender. Dr. Abernathy herself looked exactly as I remembered. Silver hair in a neat bob, intelligent. Eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, an expression of attentive neutrality that had guided me through the darkest days of my divorce. "It's good to see you again, Olivia," she said warmly. "Though I'm sorry it's under stressful circumstances. Tell me what's brought you back." I took a deep breath and recounted Connor's visit, his outrageous demand, and his manipulation involving our parents. As I spoke, Dr. Abernathy listened without interruption, occasionally jotting brief notes. When I finished, she set her notepad aside and leaned forward slightly. "Thank you for sharing that, Olivia. Before we discuss your brother's request specifically, I'd like to revisit some of the family dynamics we explored during our previous work together. It might provide helpful context for the current situation." I nodded, grateful for her methodical approach. "You've mentioned before that your parents tended to have different expectations for you and Connor growing up. Could you refresh my memory about those patterns?" This was familiar territory, ground we had covered extensively during my divorce, when I was struggling with feelings of failure despite ending a marriage that had become emotionally depleting. "It was always clear that Connor and I were held to different standards," I began. "I was expected to excel academically, to be responsible, to set an example. Connor was protected. His struggles were always attributed to external factors: teachers who didn't understand his learning style, coaches who didn't appreciate his creativity, friends who were a bad influence." "And how did those different expectations manifest in practical terms?" Dr. Abernathy prompted. "In countless ways," I replied. "When I wanted to join the swim team in high school, I had to maintain a 4.0 GPA and pay for half of the equipment myself from my babysitting job. When Connor wanted to play guitar, my parents bought him a $600 instrument and paid for private lessons, despite his D in algebra." I paused, memories surfacing that I hadn't considered in years. There was this one incident when we were teenagers. I had saved up for months to buy concert tickets for my best friend's birthday. The night before the concert, Connor took my car without permission. I had just gotten my license and got into a fender bender. The car couldn't be driven, so I missed the concert. When I got upset, my parents said I was being selfish, that accidents happen, and family forgiveness was more important than a concert. Dr. Abernathy nodded thoughtfully. "And how did these patterns continue into adulthood?" "They evolved," I said, realizing the truth of this as I spoke. When I was struggling during college, working 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a full course load, the expectation was that I would figure it out. When Connor dropped out after 3 semesters, My parents paid for him to find himself in Europe for 6 months. The message being, Dr. Abernathy left the question open. That I was capable and didn't need help, while Connor was fragile and did, I replied, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy. I became increasingly self-reliant because I had to be, while Connor never developed those skills because he was never expected to. And how has this pattern played out in your adult relationship with your brother? I considered the question carefully. We've never been close as adults, but we've been cordial. Family holidays, occasional dinners. He calls when he needs advice, or more often, money. I've loaned him cash several times for what he calls temporary setbacks, though I've stopped expecting repayment. Have you ever refused a request from Connor before yesterday? The question gave me pause. Not outright, no. I've negotiated terms or suggested alternatives, but I've never simply said no. And your parents' role in these adult interactions? They're his advocates, I said, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. Whenever I express frustration about Connor's choices or hesitation about helping him, they remind me how blessed I've been with my career, how challenging life has been for him, how families should support each other unconditionally. Dr. Abernathy nodded. So yesterday represents a significant departure from an established family pattern, one where you accommodate Connor's needs, often at personal cost, with your parents' endorsement and facilitation. Yes, I agreed, feeling a strange mix of clarity and discomfort. But this request is so outrageous that surely anyone would agree I'm justified in refusing. The reasonableness of your refusal isn't in question, Dr. Abernathy assured me. What's more interesting is why this particular request has prompted you to break the pattern when previous ones didn't. What's different this time? I considered this carefully. The scale, obviously. He's never asked for something this significant before. But it's more than that. It's the entitlement. The assumption that I would, or should, give him a house simply because he wants one and I have 2 properties, as if my financial security is less important than his comfort. That's insightful, Dr. Abernathy noted. You've identified not just the practical issue, but the underlying message that troubles you. And what about the upcoming family dinner? What concerns you most about that? The emotional manipulation, I replied without hesitation. Connor has already framed this as me choosing money over family. My mother's emails suggest she's fully bought into that narrative. I can already envision the dinner. My father's disappointed silence, my mother's tears, Connor's wounded victim role, and me cast as the selfish villain who values property over her brother's well-being. You anticipate being overwhelmed by their united emotional pressure, Dr. Abernathy summarized. Exactly. And historically, that approach has worked. I end up conceding to maintain family peace, to avoid being labeled cold or uncaring. Dr. Abernathy was quiet for a moment, considering, what if we approach Sunday's dinner as an opportunity rather than a trial? An opportunity for what? For establishing new patterns, for communicating your boundaries clearly and compassionately, not with the goal of convincing them you're right. That may not be possible given the entrenched dynamics you've described, but with the goal of being authentic about your position, regardless of their reaction. The concept was both appealing and terrifying. How do I do that when they're experts at making me doubt myself? By preparing thoroughly, Dr. Abernathy said with a small smile. Let's develop some specific strategies for Sunday. But first, I'd like to explore a bit more history, specifically about your properties and how you acquired them. These details might be helpful for clarifying your position, both to yourself and potentially to your family. For the next hour, we delved into my financial journey, the sacrifices I'd made to purchase my first home with Eric, the difficult decision to keep the condo in the divorce settlement despite its emotional associations, the careful budgeting and additional work, I'd taken on to manage its mortgage while renovating my current house. We discussed my future plans for both properties and the financial security they represented, especially as a woman who had experienced the economic vulnerability that can come with divorce. "Let me ask you this," Dr. Abernathy said as our session was drawing to a close. "If Connor truly needed housing, if he were actually facing homelessness rather than simply preferring ownership to renting, what kind of support would you be willing to offer?" The question helped clarify my thinking. I'd offer temporary housing in the condo with clear terms, a specific time frame, perhaps reduced rent but not free, expectations about maintaining the property. I'd help him develop a plan for financial independence, but I wouldn't give him permanent, unrestricted access to a property I've worked so hard to secure. That sounds like a thoughtful, generous alternative to his demand, Dr. Abernathy observed. One that offers genuine support while maintaining appropriate boundaries. "But it won't be enough for him," I said, already anticipating Connor's reaction. "He doesn't want support toward independence. He wants a valuable asset without the work of earning it." "Perhaps," Dr. Abernathy agreed, "but by articulating a clear alternative that you are comfortable with, you shift the conversation from a binary yes or no to a more nuanced discussion of what kind of help you're willing to provide. It also reveals whether his true concern is housing security or simply acquiring property." As our time came to an end, Dr. Abernathy helped me develop a concrete plan for Sunday's dinner. We practiced responses to the emotional tactics I anticipated, focusing on calm, clear statements of my position rather than defensive reactions to their pressure. We also discussed the importance of identifying my non-negotiables before the dinner and staying connected to them throughout the conversation. "Remember," Dr. Abernathy said as I prepared to leave, "the goal isn't to convince them you're right. The goal is to communicate your boundaries clearly and consistently, regardless of their response. Their reactions belong to them, not to you." I left the session feeling more centered than I had since Connor's visit. The anxiety hadn't disappeared, but it had been replaced by a sense of purpose and clarity. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, I was approaching a family conflict not as a problem to be solved through accommodation, but as an opportunity to establish healthier patterns for all of us. The remainder of Friday and most of Saturday, I focused on preparing for Sunday's dinner. I drafted and refined a clear statement of my position, practicing it until it felt natural. I identified potential emotional triggers and developed responses that were both compassionate and firm. I reminded myself repeatedly that saying no to Connor's demand wasn't selfish. It was appropriate self-care and an opportunity for him to develop greater self-reliance. But preparation wasn't limited to the upcoming confrontation. I also began researching resources that might genuinely help Connor if he was willing to accept something other than a free house. I compiled information about affordable housing programs, financial literacy workshops, and career counseling services. I calculated what I could reasonably offer in terms of temporary reduced rent at the condo, should he be interested in a legitimate pathway to stability rather than an immediate handout. Saturday evening, as I was reviewing my notes one final time, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Olivia, honey." Her voice had that particular tone of forced cheerfulness that always preceded a difficult request. "I'm just finalizing plans for tomorrow." "Connor mentioned you might be bringing some property paperwork?" The assumption was so brazen, it momentarily left me speechless. They were proceeding as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion, despite no actual communication from me on the subject. "Mom," I said carefully, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't agreed to give Connor either of my properties." There was a pause, then a deep sigh. "Oh, Olivia, Connor said you might be hesitant, but we really thought you'd have come around by now. He's in such a difficult position with the breakup." "I understand he's going through a challenging time," I replied, sticking to the script I'd prepared. and I'm willing to discuss ways I can support him, but transferring ownership of a property isn't one of them. I don't think you understand the severity of his situation, my mother countered, her voice taking on an edge. He's essentially homeless, Olivia. His mental health is suffering. As his sister, surely you want to help. Of course I want to help, Mom, but giving him a house isn't the only way to do that. In fact, I've been researching alternatives that might be more beneficial in the long term. Alternatives? She sounded dubious. Like what? I'd prefer to discuss that tomorrow when we're all together, I said, not wanting to get drawn into a detailed negotiation without Connor present. But I want to be clear that I won't be bringing property transfer paperwork. Another deep sigh. Well, this will be disappointing for everyone, but especially your father. He was so proud of you for stepping up to help your brother. The attempt at invoking my father's approval, something I'd sought for most of my life, was exactly the kind of emotional lever Dr. Abernathy had helped me prepare for. I care deeply about Dad's opinion, I acknowledged, and I hope he'll see that I'm trying to help Connor in ways that promote his long-term well-being, not just a quick fix. I suppose we'll see tomorrow, my mother said, her tone making it clear she had little faith in my approach. Dinner's at 5. Please try to come with an open heart, Olivia. After we hung up, I sat with the discomfort of the conversation. In the past, my mother's disapproval would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt and eventual capitulation. Now, while I still felt the emotional pull, I could also recognize the manipulation for what it was. The suggestion that refusing to give away a property indicated a closed heart, rather than appropriate boundaries, was exactly the kind of false equivalency that had kept me locked in unhealthy family patterns for years. Sunday arrived with a mix of anxiety and resolve. I dressed carefully in an outfit that made me feel confident and centered. A navy blue dress I'd worn to close an important client deal, paired with simple gold jewelry that had been a gift to myself after my promotion to marketing director. As I drove to my parents' suburban home, I practiced deep breathing and reminded myself of Dr. Abernathy's words. Their reactions belong to them, not to you. The house looked exactly as it always had, a well-maintained colonial with my mother's. Impeccable landscaping and seasonal wreath on the front door. It had been a stable, comfortable upbringing in many ways, which made the dysfunctional patterns harder to recognize and address. Material needs were always met. It was the emotional dynamics that had proven problematic. My father answered the door, embracing me with the same bear hug he'd given since childhood. Despite our complicated relationship, there was genuine affection there. "There's my girl," he said warmly. "Come on in. Your mother's just finishing up in the kitchen." The familiar scent of pot roast, my brother's favorite, filled the house. I found my mother arranging a vegetable platter, her movements precise and practiced. "Olivia," she greeted me, offering her cheek for a kiss. "I'm glad you could make it. Connor's in the den watching the game." The casual normalcy of the scene belied the tension underlying this particular visit. It would have been easy to slip into our usual roles, the dutiful daughter, the peacekeeper, and push the conflict below the surface. But that approach had never led to genuine resolution or growth. Connor barely looked up when I entered the den, his attention fixed on the football game playing on our father's massive television. "Hey," he said flatly, not meeting my eyes. "Hi, Connor," I replied, taking a seat in the adjacent armchair rather than next to him on the sofa. "How are you doing?" He shrugged. "Been better, currently crashing on Jason's couch while my sister decides whether family actually means anything to her." And there it was, the victim narrative, the implied moral failure on my part, the attempt to make his housing situation my responsibility rather than the result of his own choices. In the past, I might have apologized reflexively, tried to explain my position, or become defensive. Instead, I simply nodded. "I understand you're in a difficult situation. I've been thinking about ways I might be able to help. He glanced at me, curiosity briefly overriding his sullen demeanor. So, you're considering the condo? No, I said calmly. As I told you on Thursday, transferring ownership of either property isn't an option, but I've been researching alternatives that might genuinely support you. His face darkened. Alternatives. Right, because God forbid you part with one of your precious properties to help your only brother. Before I could respond, our mother called us to dinner. As we took our places at the dining room table, the same seats we'd occupied since childhood, I could feel the weight of unspoken expectations pressing down on me. My father said grace, including a pointed reference to generous hearts and family unity that made his position on the matter quite clear. As we began passing dishes, my mother launched the offensive I'd been anticipating. Olivia, I understand. You and Connor have been discussing a housing arrangement, she began, her tone deliberately casual. Your father and I think it's a wonderful solution. The condo would stay in the family, Connor would have the stability he needs right now, and you'd have the satisfaction of helping your brother in a meaningful way. I took a small serving of pot roast, buying a moment to compose my response. Connor and I did discuss his housing situation, I acknowledged. But there seems to be some confusion. I haven't agreed to transfer ownership of either of my properties. My father set down his fork with deliberate precision. Olivia, your brother is going through a difficult time. He needs a stable living situation to get back on his feet. I agree completely, Dad, I said, making eye contact across the table. Stability is essential. That's why I've been researching options that would provide that while also helping Connor develop greater independence. Independence? My mother echoed as if the concept were foreign. Connor doesn't need abstract life lessons. He needs a roof over his head. Connor remained unusually quiet, allowing our parents to advocate on his behalf, another familiar pattern. He'd always been skilled at enlisting others to fight his battles, presenting himself as the reasonable party while surrogates applied pressure on his behalf. I understand the immediate need for housing, I continued, maintaining the calm, clear tone I'd practiced. And I'm prepared to offer Connor a 6-month lease on the condo at significantly reduced rent, along with resources for financial counseling and career development. A lease? My mother looked genuinely bewildered. But he's your brother, not a tenant. It's about creating clear expectations and boundaries, I explained. The arrangement would provide Connor with stable housing while also respecting my financial investment in the property. This is exactly like you, Olivia, Connor finally interjected, his voice tight with resentment. Always keeping score, always calculating the cost-benefit analysis instead of just helping family, because that's what family does. That's unfair, Connor, I replied evenly. I've supported you in numerous ways over the years, emotionally, financially, professionally, but transferring a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars isn't reasonable support. It's an extraordinary gift that I'm not in a position to give. Not in a position? My father scoffed. You're doing very well at that fancy marketing job. You don't need 2 properties. Dad, with all due respect, you don't have complete information about my financial situation, I said, working to keep my voice steady. The rental income from the condo is an essential part of my ability to manage my mortgage and other financial obligations. So rent from Connor then, my mother suggested, as if offering an obvious solution. He could pay you whatever you're getting from your current tenant. I turned to Connor. Would you be able to pay $2,200 a month in rent? His expression answered before his words did. You know I can't afford that right now. That's the whole point. I need help until I get established again. Which is why I'm offering reduced rent for 6 months, I reiterated. It's substantial help without compromising my financial security or preventing you from developing your own. It's not enough, Connor insisted. Do you have any idea how hard it is out there? Housing prices are insane. Interest rates are through the roof. I'll never be able to buy a place of my own without help. Many people face those same challenges, I pointed out. They save, they build credit, they make compromises on location or size or amenities. Not everyone has a sister with an extra property, he countered bitterly. It's not an extra property, Connor. It's an investment I've worked extremely hard to maintain, one that provides essential financial security. My mother reached across the table to place her hand over mine, her expression softening into one of maternal concern that had so often preceded emotional manipulation. Olivia, honey, I know you've always been cautious with money. It's an admirable trait in many ways, but there are more important things than financial security. Family is what sustains us through life's difficulties. Someday you might need Connor's help, and wouldn't you want him to give it freely without calculating the cost? It was a masterful pivot, recasting my reasonable boundaries as miserly calculation, suggesting that genuine family love required unlimited financial sacrifice, implying that my unwillingness to give Connor a house might someday result in him withholding help I desperately needed. Mom, I said gently, removing my hand from under hers, I agree that family support is essential, but support takes many forms, and it should empower rather than enable. The kind of help Connor needs right now isn't ownership of a property he hasn't earned. It's guidance toward creating his own stability. That's therapist talk, my father dismissed with a wave of his hand. Where are you getting these ideas? Family helps family. It's that simple. The opening was perfect, one I couldn't have planned better myself. Actually, Dad, I did consult my therapist about this situation, I said, watching their reactions carefully. I resumed sessions with Dr. Abernathy this week. My mother's expression shifted immediately to concern. Oh, Olivia, are you struggling again? You should have said something. We know the divorce was hard on you. I'm not struggling, I interrupted firmly. I'm establishing healthy boundaries in a difficult situation. Dr. Abernathy is helping me communicate those boundaries effectively. The mention of therapy and boundaries changed the energy at the table. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. Connor stabbed at his pot roast with unnecessary force. Well, my father finally said, I'm not sure what some therapist who doesn't know our family has to say about it, but in this house, we support each other. Period. I agree completely, Dad, I replied. Supporting each other is essential. We just seem to have different definitions of what constitutes genuine support. The conversation lulled as we ate in uncomfortable silence. I could feel my parents recalibrating, preparing for their next approach. Connor continued to sulk, occasionally throwing resentful glances in my direction. My mother was the first to break the silence, her voice taking on the reminiscent tone that often preceded emotional appeals based on shared history. Do you remember when Connor was 7 and fell out of the treehouse? She asked, smiling fondly at my brother. He broke his arm in 2 places. Olivia stayed by his side in the emergency room for hours, reading him stories to distract him from the pain. I remembered the incident well, not just Connor's accident, but how my parents had praised me effusively for supporting him, as if sibling compassion were extraordinary rather than expected. It was part of the pattern. Connor's needs were paramount. Meeting them was the measure of my worth. The bond between siblings is precious, my mother continued. Deeper than friendship, more enduring than many marriages. It's a relationship worth protecting, worth sacrificing for. I looked directly at Connor, who was suddenly very interested in his mashed potatoes. I've always valued our relationship, Connor, I said sincerely, and I still want to support you through this difficult time. The question isn't whether I'll help, but what form that help will take. As dinner proceeded, the conversation circled the same territory repeatedly. My parents alternated between emotional appeals and subtle guilt trips. Connor oscillated between wounded silence and bitter accusations. I maintained my position calmly and consistently, offering my alternative proposal whenever the conversation allowed. By the time dessert arrived, apple pie, Connor's favorite, the tension had evolved into a resigned standoff. My family seemed to realize that their usual tactics weren't working, but they weren't ready to accept the alternative I was offering. As I drove home that evening, I felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness at the conflict, frustration with their inability to see my perspective, but also a quiet pride in having maintained my boundaries despite intense pressure. For the first time in a family confrontation, I had remained true to myself without being drawn into unhealthy patterns of accommodation or defensive anger. I hadn't transformed their understanding, nor had I expected to, but I had changed my own participation in a dysfunctional system, and that, Dr. Abernathy had assured me, was the only part of the equation I could control. What I didn't realize then was that this dinner was just the beginning of a process that would ultimately transform not just my relationship with Connor, but our entire family dynamic. The journey ahead would involve more conflict, unexpected allies, painful revelations, and ultimately, a kind of healing I couldn't yet imagine. The foundation had been laid for change, not through giving away a house, but through something far more valuable: the courage to disrupt patterns that no longer served any of us, even when that disruption created short-term discomfort. True transformation, I would learn, rarely comes from grand gestures or immediate capitulation. It emerges gradually through consistent, principled action, the kind that values long-term growth over temporary peace. The week following the tense family dinner unfolded in ways I hadn't anticipated. I expected continued pressure from my parents, more phone calls, more emotional appeals, but instead, I was met with radio silence. No texts checking if I'd reconsidered, no emails with links to articles about family obligation. Nothing. This silence was unprecedented. In our family dynamic, conflict was typically addressed through escalating pressure until someone, usually me, capitulated. The absence of that familiar pattern left me feeling oddly untethered, as if a script I'd rehearsed for my entire life had suddenly been rewritten without my knowledge. By Wednesday afternoon, curiosity and concern finally prompted me to call my mother. "Hi, Mom," I said when she answered. "Just checking in. I haven't heard from you since Sunday." "Oh, hello, Olivia," she replied, her voice polite but distant. "Yes, we've been quite busy. Your father's Rotary Club is organizing that charity golf tournament, you know." The coolness in her tone was unmistakable. This was the voice she reserved for neighbors who planted inappropriate shrubs or distant relatives who forgot to send thank-you notes. It had rarely been directed at me. "I see," I said, unsure how to navigate this new territory. "I thought perhaps we could talk more about Connor's situation. I'm still committed to helping him, just not in the way he initially asked." "I think Connor is exploring other options now," she said vaguely. "Sometimes when one door closes, another opens." Before I could inquire further, she smoothly changed the subject to an upcoming community garden tour, effectively shutting down any substantive conversation about my brother. After a few minutes of stilted small talk, we ended the call with promises to speak again soon. Promises we both knew were mere social convention. Something had shifted fundamentally in our family system, and the realization was both liberating and unsettling. I had expected to be the primary agent of change by maintaining my boundaries. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the entire family dynamic would reconfigure itself in response. Thursday morning, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. "This is Aunt Sharon. Please call me when you have a moment. It's about Connor." Aunt Sharon, my father's sister, had always been something of a family outlier. Unmarried, childless by choice, and refreshingly direct, she maintained a cordial but distant relationship with my parents. We saw her at major holidays and family events, but she wasn't part of our regular orbit. I had always liked her, though. I knew my mother found her abrasive, and my father sometimes described her as too independent for her own good. Curious about this unexpected contact, I called her during my lunch break. "Olivia, thank you for calling back so promptly," she said, skipping the usual pleasantries. "I understand your brother has been staying with you since his breakup with Kira." The statement was so wildly inaccurate that it took me a moment to respond. "That's not correct at all, Aunt Sharon. Connor asked me to give him one of my properties, which I declined. He's never stayed with me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I see," she finally said. "That's not the version of events your mother shared when she called, asking if I might take Connor in, as Olivia has rescinded her offer of housing. She made it sound as if you'd promised him accommodation, and then changed your mind, leaving him homeless." The misrepresentation was so blatant it momentarily left me speechless. My mother had deliberately mischaracterized the situation to make me appear callous while seeking alternative housing for Connor, a solution I had offered, but they had rejected. "That's absolutely false," I said, working to keep my voice steady. "Connor demanded I give him ownership of either my current home or my rental property. When I refused, he and my parents tried to pressure me into changing my mind. I offered him a 6-month lease at reduced rent with support for financial planning, but they weren't interested in anything short of a property transfer." "Well, that sounds considerably more reasonable than what your mother described," Auntie Sharon remarked dryly, "though I can't say I'm surprised by the discrepancy. Sarah has always had a talent for revising reality to suit her narrative, especially where Connor is concerned." The candid assessment of my mother was jarring, but also refreshing. Few people in our extended family ever spoke openly about the dynamics that had seemed so obvious yet remained unnamed. "I've always tried to support Connor appropriately," I explained, feeling a curious need to justify myself to this relative I barely knew. "But giving him a house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars isn't reasonable support, especially given his history of financial instability." "You don't need to convince me," Aunt Sharon assured me. "I'm familiar with Connor's pattern of expecting others to solve his problems. It's been carefully cultivated over many years." Her directness was startling after decades of family conversations filled with euphemisms and careful avoidance of uncomfortable truths. "Do you know where Connor is staying now?" I asked, genuinely concerned despite the conflict. "That's actually why I called. Your mother asked if he could stay with me temporarily. I agreed to 2 weeks, provided he contributes to household expenses and follows certain rules. He moved in yesterday, and I'm already questioning my decision." "What's happened?" "Nothing dramatic. He arrived 5 hours later than agreed upon, immediately complained about my small guest room, and informed me that his friend Jason will be dropping off his belongings this weekend, apparently including a drum set he failed to mention previously." Despite the tension of the situation, I found myself smiling at her matter-of-fact description. "That sounds like Connor," I acknowledged. "He has a tendency to expand initial agreements." "Indeed, which is why I wanted to speak with you directly. Your mother presented you as the villain in this scenario, but my instinct was that there might be more to the story. I've always found you to be responsible and level-headed, even as a child." The validation from this unexpected source was surprisingly affecting. After days of being cast as selfish and uncaring by my closest family members, having someone recognize my perspective felt like a gift. "Thank you for that," I said sincerely. "It's been a difficult situation. I want to help Connor, but not at the expense of my own financial security, and not in ways that ultimately enable his dependence." "A perfectly reasonable position," Aunt Sharon agreed. "One which I intend to maintain as well during his stay with me. 2 weeks, defined expectations, and no drum set in my home office, despite his assertion that it's the only room with proper acoustics." We both laughed, and then Aunt Sharon's tone grew more serious. Olivia, I hope you don't mind my saying this, but you remind me very much of myself at your age. I also struggled with your parents' expectations and their different standards for behavior. It took me years to establish boundaries that allowed for a relationship without constant acquiescence to their demands. How did you do it? I asked, genuinely curious about this woman who had apparently navigated the same challenging family waters I was currently treading. Not perfectly, and not without cost, she admitted. There were periods of estrangement, particularly after I declined to loan your father money for one of his investment schemes in the 90s. But eventually, we reached a détente based on mutual respect for our differences. I'm invited to family gatherings, they accept my occasional gifts, and we simply don't discuss certain topics. That sounds civilized, if a bit distant, I observed. It's what was possible given the circumstances, she replied pragmatically. I'd have preferred a warmer relationship, but not at the price of surrendering my autonomy or financial security. Sometimes the healthiest family relationship is one with clear boundaries, even if it doesn't match the hallmark ideal. After we ended the call, I sat at my desk contemplating this unexpected connection. Aunt Sharon had navigated similar challenges decades before, charting a course that preserved both her independence and some form of family relationship. Her example offered a potential model for my own path forward, not a perfect solution, but a workable one. The following evening, I received my first direct communication from Connor since the Sunday dinner. It came in the form of a text message that managed to be both accusatory and manipulative. Hope you're happy. Now that you've turned Mom and Dad against me too, I'm stuck in Aunt Sharon's guest room with her ridiculous house rules. All because you couldn't share your good fortune with family. The message was so characteristic of Connor's perspective that it might have been comical if it weren't so frustrating. In his narrative, his current circumstances were entirely my fault, rather than the natural consequence of his choices. The fact that our parents had apparently expressed some disappointment in him, a rarity in our family system, was likewise attributed to my influence rather than his own behavior. I considered not responding at all, but decided a brief factual reply was warranted. I'm sorry you're unhappy with your current living situation. My offer of a 6-month lease at reduced rent still stands if you're interested in discussing it. His response came almost instantly. Of course you'd still try to profit off me. No thanks. I let the conversation end there, recognizing that engaging further would only reinforce his victim narrative. But the exchange left me with a lingering question. Had our parents actually expressed disappointment with Connor, or was that merely his perception? The idea that they might have held him accountable in some small way seemed almost unthinkable given our family history, yet something had clearly shifted in the dynamic. Saturday morning brought another unexpected development. My father called, a rarity in itself, as he typically left family communication to my mother. Olivia, he began without preamble, I'm calling about the Johnson property. The Johnson property was a small commercial building downtown that my father, a real estate attorney, had helped me review when I was considering diversifying my investments the previous year. We had ultimately decided it wasn't the right opportunity, and I hadn't thought about it since. What about it? I asked, confused by this seemingly random topic. It's back on the market, significantly reduced. The owners are divorcing and need a quick sale. I thought you might want to reconsider. The business-like tone was so at odds with our last interaction that it took me a moment to adjust. There was no mention of Connor, no reference to our tense dinner, not even a hint of the emotional standoff that had dominated our family communications for nearly 2 weeks. I appreciate you thinking of me, Dad, but I'm not in a position to take on another property right now. I paused, then decided to address the elephant in the room. Have you spoken with Connor recently? Is he settling in at Aunt Sharon's? My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Connor is adjusting. Sharon has always been rather rigid about her expectations. The careful phrasing told me volumes. Connor was clearly struggling with Aunt Sharon's boundaries, but my father was unwilling to directly acknowledge that reality. "Dad," I said gently, "I'm still concerned about Connor's situation. I'm still willing to help in ways that make sense for both of us." There was a long pause before he responded. "Your mother and I have been discussing things. We may have reacted strongly at dinner. It's just that we've always wanted the best for both our children." Coming from my father, this qualified acknowledgement was unprecedented. He had never before suggested that any approach to Connor might have been misguided. "I understand that, Dad. I know you both love us and want us to be secure and happy." "Yes, well," he said, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional territory. "Regarding the Johnson property, the asking price is now $425,000. Just thought you should know. I'll email you the updated listing." And just like that, we were back to safer ground. Real estate and investment opportunities rather than family dynamics and emotional boundaries. It wasn't the deep conversation about our family patterns that I might have wished for, but it was something, a small acknowledgement that perhaps their response had been disproportionate, a tentative step toward a more balanced relationship. The following week brought a series of subtle shifts in the family system. My mother called to invite me to her garden club's annual luncheon, a social olive branch that made no reference to our ongoing conflict. My father emailed several property listings that might interest you given your investment goals. Connor remained at Aunt Sharon's, though according to her increasingly amused text updates, he was finding her expectations for household contribution and basic courtesy unreasonably demanding. It was as if the family had collectively decided to pretend the conflict had never happened, a familiar strategy from my childhood, when uncomfortable confrontations were typically followed by studious avoidance rather than resolution. The difference this time was that no one seemed to expect me to revert to my usual role of accommodating Connor's demands to restore family peace. This uneasy detente might have continued indefinitely, if not for a chance encounter that forced the issues back to the surface. 3 weeks after the Sunday dinner showdown, I was shopping at the farmer's market when I literally bumped into Kira, Connor's ex-girlfriend, examining heirloom tomatoes at a vendor stall. "Olivia!" she exclaimed, clearly surprised. "I'm so sorry. I wasn't watching where I was going." "No worries," I assured her. "It's good to see you, Kira. How have you been?" We had always gotten along well during her relationship with Connor. She was intelligent and straightforward, with a grounded practicality that had seemed like a positive influence on my brother. I had been genuinely disappointed when Connor announced their breakup. "I've been okay," she said with a slight hesitation. "Adjusting to living alone again. How about you? And how's Connor doing?" The question seemed sincere, with no hint of the bitterness often accompanying recent breakups. "Connor is staying with our aunt temporarily while he figures out his next steps," I explained, keeping my response neutral. Kira frowned slightly. "I thought he was staying with you? That's what he told me when he came to pick up the last of his things." The contradiction was jarring. "No, he never stayed with me. In fact—" I paused, unsure how much to share about our conflict. Kira seemed to sense my hesitation. "Let me guess. He asked for something unreasonable, and when you didn't immediately agree, he made it sound like you were abandoning him in his time of need." Her accuracy was startling. "Something like that? Yes." She sighed, shifting her market basket to her other arm. "Classic Connor. That's actually why we broke up, you." "No, not because I kicked him out as he probably told you, but because I finally realized the pattern would never change." My curiosity was piqued. "What pattern, exactly?" Kira glanced at her watch. "I have about 20 minutes before I need—" to be somewhere. Coffee? She gestured toward a small cafe at the edge of the market. Over lattes at a corner table, Kira shared a perspective on Connor that both confirmed my own experiences and provided new insights. When Connor and I first got together, his charm and creativity were irresistible, she explained. He was fun, spontaneous, always planning these grand adventures or creative projects. The fact that most never materialized seemed charming at first. He was a dreamer, an idea person. I nodded, recognizing this familiar characterization of my brother. But after we moved in together, I started noticing patterns. Bills he was supposed to pay would be left until the last minute, or not paid at all. He'd make major purchases without discussion, then be shocked when I was upset about the impact on our budget. He'd agree to responsibilities around the apartment, then either forget or do such a poor job that I'd end up taking over. That sounds familiar, I acknowledged, thinking of similar patterns I'd observed over the years. The breaking point came when I discovered he'd been using my credit card for online purchases, over $3,000 worth, without my knowledge or permission. When confronted, he acted like I was overreacting because it's not like we don't share everything anyway. I winced at this revelation. I'm so sorry, Kira. I had no idea. She waved away my apology. It's not your responsibility. But after that, I insisted on separate finances and told him he needed to reimburse me for the charges. He agreed, seemed genuinely contrite, and promised to change. 2 months later, not only had he not repaid a single dollar, but I discovered he'd opened a store credit card using my address and employment information. That's actually fraud, I said, shocked despite my familiarity with Connor's financial irresponsibility. Exactly. When I confronted him again, he turned it around on me, said I was being obsessed with money and keeping score instead of supporting him during a difficult time. He claimed he'd been trying to build his credit to create a better future for us. The phrasing was so eerily similar to what Connor had said to me, accusing me of keeping score rather than helping family, that I felt a chill of recognition. So I ended it, Kira continued. I told him he had 30 days to find new living arrangements, as specified in our lease agreement, which, thankfully, was in my name only. He spent those 30 days alternating between trying to win me back and making me feel like a heartless monster for enforcing consequences. And then what happened? I asked, invested in her story. He left dramatically on day 30, taking only some of his belongings and leaving me with quite a mess to clean up. He told mutual friends I'd thrown him out suddenly, that I was keeping his possessions hostage, that I'd changed overnight from loving partner to cold-hearted stranger. The parallel to my own experience was striking. Connor had employed the same tactics with me, misrepresenting the situation to family members, casting himself as the victim of my unreasonable cruelty, attempting to use social pressure to force compliance with his demands. A week after he left, Kira continued, he called saying he'd rethought everything and wanted to make things right. He asked if he could come over to talk. I agreed, hoping for actual accountability. Instead, he presented me with a reconciliation plan that involved me adding him to the deed of my condo, which I'd purchased before we met, so he would have security and could rebuild his life. When I refused, he accused me of never having loved him at all. I nearly choked on my latte. He asked you to add him to your deed, after everything that had happened? Kira nodded, a rueful smile playing at her lips. The most amazing part was that he genuinely seemed to believe it was a reasonable request, that if I truly cared about him, I would naturally want to give him half ownership of my most valuable asset. The parallels to my own experience were undeniable. Connor hadn't just tried this manipulation with me. It was apparently his go-to strategy when he needed housing. The realization solidified my confidence in the boundaries I'd established, while also raising concerns about my brother's pattern of exploiting those closest to him. I had no idea he'd tried the same approach with you, I said, feeling a new kinship with this woman I barely knew. When he demanded I give him one of my properties, I thought it was an anomaly, an outrageous request born of desperation. Not an anomaly, Kira said with certainty. It's his playbook. Create a crisis, identify someone with resources, present himself as the victim, demand an extreme solution, then attack the person's character when they refuse. As our conversation continued, Kira shared other patterns she'd observed during their relationship, Connor's talent for rewriting history to cast himself in a favorable light, his skill at triangulating relationships to avoid direct accountability, his genuine belief that he was perpetually underappreciated and mistreated, despite consistent support from others. The saddest part, she concluded as we prepared to leave, is that Connor does have real gifts. He's creative, charming, and capable of great empathy when it suits him. But until he's forced to take responsibility for his choices and develop actual independence, those gifts will remain overshadowed by these destructive patterns. We exchanged contact information before parting ways, having formed an unexpected bond through our shared experiences with Connor. As I walked to my car, I felt a complex mix of emotions: validation that my assessment of the situation had been accurate, concern about Connor's entrenched patterns, and a new determination to maintain boundaries that might ultimately serve him better than the enabling he'd come to expect. That evening, I called Dr. Abernathy and scheduled another session. The conversation with Kira had provided external confirmation of patterns I'd observed, but sometimes doubted, given my family's unified front in Connor's favor. Now, with this new perspective, I wanted to develop a more comprehensive strategy for moving forward, one that would allow me to maintain relationship with my family without reverting to unhealthy dynamics. What I didn't realize then was that the chance encounter with Kira had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately force our entire family to confront long-established patterns. The foundation I'd laid by refusing Connor's unreasonable demand, and the ripple effects of that refusal through our family system, would create an opportunity for genuine change rather than merely an uneasy truce. The path ahead would not be smooth or predictable. There would be additional confrontations, surprising alliances, painful revelations, and tentative reconciliations. But for perhaps the first time in our family history, we were moving toward authenticity rather than comfortable denial, toward relationships based on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles and familiar scripts. And it had all begun with a simple, difficult word that I'd rarely used with my family before: no. My session with Dr. Abernathy proved invaluable. After sharing my conversation with Kira and the subtle shifts in my family's behavior, we strategized about maintaining healthy boundaries while leaving the door open for more authentic relationships. Dr. Abernathy helped me see that the current family détente, uncomfortable as it was, represented progress rather than failure. For the first time, I wasn't sacrificing my well-being to maintain artificial harmony. The most important thing to remember, she emphasized as our session concluded, is that you can only control your own behavior. Your family members will respond according to their own capacity for change. Some may surprise you, others may remain entrenched in familiar patterns. This perspective helped me approach the situation with realistic expectations, rather than hoping for immediate transformation. I committed to maintaining my boundaries with Connor while engaging with my parents in neutral territories where possible. If they chose to avoid discussing the conflict directly, I would respect that choice while remaining clear about my own position. What I couldn't have anticipated was my aunt's escalating role in the family drama. 2 days after my therapy session, I received a call from Aunt Sharon, her typically composed voice tinged with unmistakable frustration. "Olivia, I've made a decision about Connor's living situation," she announced without preamble. "The 2-week arrangement is ending tomorrow, not next Monday as originally agreed." "Has something happened?" I asked, concerned about this abrupt change. "Several things," she replied crisply. The final straw came last night when I returned from my book club to find Connor had hosted a small gathering in my absence. Without permission, of course. My living room reeked of marijuana. There were beer bottles on my antique side tables without coasters, and someone had apparently attempted to cook frozen pizza directly on my oven rack. Despite the seriousness of the situation, I struggled to suppress a smile at her indignant tone. Aunt Sharon's home was immaculate, filled with carefully curated antiques and art collected during her extensive travels. Connor's casual disrespect for her space was entirely characteristic, yet particularly ill-advised, given his precarious housing situation. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, genuinely sympathetic to her position. "How did Connor respond when you confronted him?" "That's the most infuriating part," she continued. "When I expressed my displeasure, he acted shocked that I was overreacting to a small get-together with friends. When I reminded him that my house rules explicitly prohibited guests without prior approval, he informed me that at 30, he's too old to live under someone else's arbitrary restrictions. Yet not too old to live under someone else's. Roof rent-free," I observed. "Precisely," Aunt Sharon agreed. "I've informed him he needs to vacate by tomorrow at 5 p.m. I've already called your parents to advise them of the situation." The mention of my parents piqued my curiosity. How did they respond? There was a slight hesitation before she answered. "Your mother attempted to persuade me to reconsider, suggesting that Connor simply doesn't understand how particular I am about my home. Your father was notably silent during most of the call, though he did eventually acknowledge that Connor should have respected my rules while staying in my house." This small shift in my father's position, acknowledging Connor's responsibility, rather than automatically defending him, seemed significant. It hinted at possible cracks in the unified front my parents had always presented regarding my brother's behavior. "What will Connor do now?" I asked, genuinely concerned about his immediate housing options. "According to your mother, he'll stay with them temporarily while figuring out next steps. She made it clear they consider this an emergency measure of limited duration, which struck me as uncharacteristically firm for Sarah. The news was surprising. In the past, my parents had provided Connor with open-ended support, without clear expectations or timelines. This new approach suggested they might be reaching their own limits with his behavior. "That's unexpected," I admitted. "They've never set boundaries with Connor before." "People can surprise you when pushed far enough," Aunt Sharon observed. I suspect my detailed description of beer bottles on heirloom furniture may have helped clarify the practical realities of housing Connor. Your mother has always been house-proud. After finishing the call with Aunt Sharon, I found myself contemplating this new development. Connor moving in with our parents seemed like a natural solution. They had plenty of space in their suburban home, and they had always been his most reliable advocates. Yet according to Aunt Sharon, they viewed this arrangement as temporary, rather than open-ended. Was it possible that my stand against Connor's unreasonable demands had inadvertently created space for my parents to establish their own boundaries? I didn't have long to wonder. The following evening, my phone lit up with Connor's name. "This is your fault," he began without greeting. "If you hadn't turned the family against me, I wouldn't be in this situation." "Hello to you too, Connor," I replied, maintaining a calm tone despite his hostility. "What situation are you referring to?" "Don't play dumb. Aunt Sharon kicked me out because you poisoned her against me, and now Mom and Dad are treating me like some kind of delinquent teenager with their ridiculous house rules and 4-week limit." The revelation that my parents had established both rules and a timeline was genuinely surprising. "I didn't discuss you with Aunt Sharon beyond confirming what actually happened when you asked me for my property," I clarified. "And I haven't spoken with Mom and Dad about their arrangements with you." "Right," he scoffed. "So it's just coincidence that everyone's suddenly treating me like I'm some kind of freeloader?" The irony of his statement was striking, given that he was, by definition, staying in others' homes without contributing financially. But pointing this out would only escalate his defensiveness. "What exactly are Mom and Dad asking of you?" I inquired instead, curious about these unprecedented boundaries. "They've given me a written agreement," he said, the eye roll practically audible in his tone. "I have to be actively job hunting every weekday. No guests without advance notice. No coming home after midnight on weeknights. Contributing to household chores. And the kicker, I have 4 weeks to secure independent housing arrangements. Or present a concrete plan with timeline for doing so." The structured approach was so out of character for my parents that I momentarily wondered if Connor was exaggerating. But the specific details suggested he was accurately reporting their new stance, however incredulous he might be about it. "That sounds like reasonable support to help you get back on your feet," I observed. "It's controlling and humiliating," he countered. "I'm their son, not some random tenant. And now they're suggesting I consider your generous offer of a temporary lease at the condo. Did you put them up to this?" "Connor, I haven't spoken to Mom and Dad about you since that Sunday dinner. Whatever they're suggesting comes from them, not me." There was a moment of silence as he seemed to process this information. "Well, they've obviously changed since you refused to help me. Dad's talking about how both our children need to stand on their own 2 feet, and Mom's suddenly concerned about enabling dependency patterns. And the language sounded like it might have come from a family counselor or self-help book, rather than my parents' typical vocabulary. Were they seeking outside guidance? The possibility was both surprising and hopeful. "Look," Connor continued, his tone shifting from accusatory to persuasive. "I know we got off on the wrong foot with this whole property thing. I was stressed about the breakup and not thinking clearly. But I really do need help getting established again." This conciliatory approach was familiar. It typically preceded a revised request that, while less extreme than the original demand, still served his interests above all others. "What kind of help are you looking for now?" I asked cautiously. "I've been thinking about your offer of the condo with reduced rent," he said, confirming my prediction. "It makes sense as a temporary solution, but 6 months isn't really enough time to get fully established, especially in this job market. What about a 1-year lease with an option to extend if needed?" While more reasonable than his initial demand for ownership, this revised proposal still prioritized his flexibility over my financial needs. The reduced rent he was suggesting would mean months of negative cash flow on the property, and an open-ended arrangement would prevent me from finding a market-rate tenant when the rental market improved. "I'd be open to discussing a 6-month lease with clear terms," I reiterated, "including a proper rental agreement, security deposit, and defined expectations for property maintenance. If you demonstrate reliability during those 6 months, we could discuss an extension at that point." "Why can't you just trust me from the beginning?" he complained. "Why does everything have to be so formal and businesslike between us? We're family." "Trust is built through consistent behavior over time," I explained. "A clear agreement protects both of us by establishing shared expectations. It's not about lack of trust. It's about creating a foundation for a positive landlord-tenant relationship that won't damage our sibling relationship." "Landlord-tenant?" he repeated with evident distaste. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're treating me like a business transaction instead of your brother." "I'm treating this potential housing arrangement as the business matter it is," I corrected gently. "Our sibling relationship exists separately from any financial agreements between us." The conversation continued in circles, with Connor attempting various approaches to secure more favorable terms, emotional appeals about family loyalty, guilt trips about my financial security compared to his struggles, vague promises about his imminent career breakthrough. I maintained my position calmly and consistently, refusing to be drawn into defensive justifications or emotional responses. Finally, sensing he wasn't making headway, Connor shifted tactics again. "Fine, I'll think about your offer. but I need to see the actual terms in writing before I can decide. And I'd want Dad to review any agreement before I sign anything. This was progress. He was acknowledging the legitimacy of a formal agreement, even if reluctantly. I can draft a simple lease agreement for your review, I offered. And I have no objection to Dad reviewing it from a legal perspective. After we ended the call, I felt cautiously optimistic. While Connor clearly remained focused on maximizing his own benefit, he had moved from outrageous demands to negotiation, a significant step toward more realistic expectations. Moreover, our parents appeared to be establishing their own boundaries, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, creating a united front of reasonable expectations rather than enabling dependency. The following week brought further developments. I drafted a straightforward 6-month lease agreement for the condo, specifying reduced rent for the first 3 months, followed by a gradual increase to market rate, along with standard expectations. For property maintenance and adherence to HOA regulations, I emailed copies to both Connor and my father, inviting their feedback while maintaining the core terms as non-negotiable. My father's response came within hours, a brief email acknowledging receipt and promising to review the document, followed by an unexpected postscript. Your mother and I have an appointment with Family Connections Counseling Center on Thursday. Connor doesn't know yet. The revelation that my parents were seeking professional guidance was astonishing. Throughout my childhood and adult life, they had dismissed therapy as unnecessary for normal families and had been particularly resistant to suggestions that their parenting approach with Connor might contribute to his ongoing struggles. This radical departure from their previous stance suggested a significant shift in their perspective. My curiosity about this development warred with my commitment to respecting the current détente. Directly asking about their counseling would likely be perceived as intrusive, potentially derailing their nascent efforts toward change. Instead, I responded simply to the lease review, thanking my father for his attention to the matter and expressing openness to their considered feedback. 2 days later, I received another unexpected call, this time from my mother. "Olivia," she began, her voice carrying its familiar warmth but with an undercurrent of uncertainty I rarely heard from her. "I'm calling about your brother. Is everything okay with Connor?" I asked, immediately concerned by her tone. "He's adjusting to being back home," she said carefully. "It's been an adjustment for all of us, to be honest. That's partially why I'm calling. Your father and I have been attending some sessions at Family Connections, and we've been encouraged to examine certain patterns in our family dynamics." The hesitation in her voice was unprecedented. My mother had always spoken with absolute certainty about family matters, particularly where Connor was concerned. "That sounds like a positive step," I offered neutrally, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Yes, well," she continued. "With evident discomfort, our counselor, Dr. Peterson, suggested that we may have created different expectations for you and Connor that weren't entirely equitable." It was perhaps the most significant understatement I'd ever heard from my mother, and it took considerable restraint not to react with incredulous laughter. Instead, I remained silent, allowing her space to continue this difficult acknowledgement. "We've always believed we were supporting you both in the ways you individually needed," she went on. "You were so naturally capable and independent, while Connor struggled more with structure and follow-through. I understand that different children sometimes need different approaches," I said carefully. "Yes, but Dr. Peterson has helped us see that perhaps our approach with Connor has enabled certain patterns rather than helping him develop independence." She paused, then added with evident difficulty, "And we may have taken your self-sufficiency for granted, expecting you to continually accommodate your brother's needs because you seemed better able to manage without additional support." The acknowledgement, however carefully phrased, was unprecedented. My mother had never before suggested that their parenting approach might have contributed to Connor's ongoing struggles or placed unfair burdens on me. That's very insightful, Mom, I managed, genuinely moved by her willingness to reconsider such fundamental family dynamics. Dr. Peterson has suggested that we invite you to join us for a family session, she continued, to discuss healthier patterns moving forward. Connor would be included as well, of course. The invitation represented both opportunity and risk. Family therapy could potentially facilitate meaningful change in our long-established patterns, but it could also devolve into another forum for Connor to position himself as the victim of unreasonable expectations. Moreover, I had my own therapeutic relationship with Dr. Abernathy, who understood my history and perspective in depth. I appreciate the invitation, I said thoughtfully. Before I decide, I'd like to consult with my own therapist about whether joining your sessions would be beneficial or if parallel individual work might be more effective. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. In the past, any hesitation to immediately accommodate a family request would have been met with subtle guilt trips or expressions of disappointment. Instead, my mother simply said, "That seems reasonable." Dr. Peterson actually suggested something similar, that you might have your own therapeutic support already. The conversation concluded with a tentative warmth that felt more authentic than our recent interactions. My mother expressed genuine interest in my current work projects and mentioned a community garden initiative she thought might interest me, carefully avoiding further discussion of Connor or family therapy until I'd had time to consult with Dr. Abernathy. As I reflected on the call afterward, I was struck by the profound shift it represented. My mother, who had spent decades defending her parenting choices and dismissing any suggestion that Connor might benefit from firmer boundaries, was not only seeking professional guidance, but also beginning to acknowledge problematic patterns in our family system. It was a level of self-reflection I had never witnessed from her before. During my next session with Dr. Abernathy, we discussed the invitation to join family therapy extensively. She helped me weigh the potential benefits against the risks, considering both my individual healing journey and the family system as a whole. In situations like this, she explained, parallel work is often most effective. You continuing individual therapy with me while they work with their family counselor. However, occasional joint sessions can facilitate important conversations in a structured, supported environment. What if it just becomes another forum for Connor to cast himself as the victim and me as the villain? I asked, voicing my primary concern. That's a legitimate risk, she acknowledged. But remember that the family counselor has already begun challenging your parents' enabling patterns with Connor. They're likely alert to those dynamics now and better equipped to recognize them when they emerge. With Dr. Abernathy's guidance, I decided to accept the invitation for a single joint session, while making clear to my parents that I would continue my individual work with Dr. Abernathy regardless of how the family session proceeded. This approach allowed me to engage with their efforts toward change while maintaining my independent therapeutic support. The joint session was scheduled for the following week at Family Connections, a community counseling center known for its work with family systems. As the date approached, I experienced a complex mix of emotions: hope that meaningful change might be possible, anxiety about potential regression into familiar dysfunctional patterns, and a surprising sense of pride that I had maintained my boundaries firmly enough to create space for this family reconsideration. The day before the scheduled session, I received an unexpected text from Connor. "About tomorrow, I know things have been tense between us. Whatever happens in the session, I want you to know I'm trying to see things differently. The lease terms you sent over are fair. I'm ready to sign if the offer still stands." The message was so contrary to Connor's usual approach that I initially wondered if someone else had written it for him. There was no emotional manipulation, no subtle guilt trip, not even an attempt to negotiate better terms. Just a straightforward acceptance of the agreement as presented, and an acknowledgement of tension without blaming me for it. I responded, cautiously, The offer still stands. We can finalize the details after tomorrow's session. His reply came moments later. Looking forward to moving forward. See you tomorrow. The exchange left me both hopeful and wary. Connor's apparent shift toward reasonableness could represent genuine growth, but it might also be strategic cooperation designed to secure housing before reverting to familiar patterns. Either way, the formal lease agreement would provide structure and clear expectations, protecting both my property and our sibling relationship from the ambiguity that had facilitated previous conflicts. The morning of the family session, I woke early, taking extra time to prepare both practically and emotionally. I reviewed my notes from recent therapy sessions, reminding myself of the boundaries and communication strategies Dr. Abernathy and I had discussed. I chose my outfit carefully, professional enough to feel confident but casual enough to avoid appearing defensive or overly formal. I practiced deep breathing techniques to center myself before difficult conversations. Despite this preparation, nothing could have fully readied me for what occurred in that session. A radical departure from decades of family patterns that would ultimately create the foundation for healing I hadn't dared to hope was possible. As I drove to Family Connections, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. It had begun with a simple, difficult refusal, my no to Connor's outrageous demand for one of my properties. That boundary, maintained despite intense family pressure, had created ripple effects throughout our entire family system. My parents had sought professional guidance. Connor had begun to recognize that his usual manipulation tactics were no longer effective. Aunt Sharon had emerged as an unexpected ally, reinforcing the importance of personal responsibility and clear expectations. What had initially seemed like a conflict about property had revealed itself as something far more significant, a pivotal opportunity to redefine our family relationships on healthier terms. The road ahead would not be smooth or predictable, and lasting change would require consistent effort from all of us. But for the first time in our family history, we were moving toward authenticity rather than comfortable denial. And it had all begun with the courage to protect my own boundaries, even when doing so disrupted long-established family patterns. The journey was far from complete, but the foundation for genuine change had been laid, not through accommodation or surrender, but through the quiet strength of standing firmly in my own truth. The Family Connections Counseling Center occupied a converted Victorian house on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. As I parked along the curb, I noticed my parents' sedan already in the small lot. Taking a final deep breath, I reminded myself that regardless of what happened inside, I had already grown stronger through this process. The receptionist directed me to a comfortable room on the second floor. Unlike the sterile conference rooms, I'd imagined this space featured overstuffed couches, soft lighting, and windows overlooking a small garden. My parents sat together on one sofa, while Connor occupied an armchair near the window, scrolling through his phone. Dr. Peterson, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and an air of calm authority, rose to greet me. "You must be Olivia. I'm Dr. Peterson. Thank you for joining us today." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, but not overly familiar. "Please, make yourself comfortable." I chose the remaining armchair, positioning it so I could see everyone without feeling cornered. Connor glanced up briefly, offering a tense nod before returning to his phone. My mother smiled nervously while my father studied his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Before we begin," Dr. Peterson explained, "I'd like to establish some guidelines for our discussion. Each person will have uninterrupted time to share their perspective. We'll practice active listening without immediate response. When someone is speaking, the rest of us are just listening, not planning rebuttals or defenses." Does that sound workable to everyone? We all nodded, though Connor's agreement seemed reluctant. "Excellent. I've been working with your parents and Connor for several sessions now, Olivia, so they've already had opportunities to share their perspectives on the family dynamics. I think it would be valuable to begin with your view of the situation. Being invited to speak first was unexpected. In our family system, my perspective was typically considered last, if at all. I gathered my thoughts, determined to be honest without becoming accusatory. "Thank you for including me today," I began carefully. "The immediate situation involves Connor asking me to give him one of my properties after his breakup with Kira. When I refused, it created significant tension in our family. But I think the real issues go much deeper and have been developing for many years." I proceeded to outline the patterns I'd observed, the different expectations for Connor and me throughout childhood, the family's tendency to prioritize his needs over mine, and the enabling behaviors that had prevented him from developing independence and resilience. "I want to be clear that I love my family," I continued, making eye contact with each of them. "And I genuinely want to support Connor. But I've realized that true support means encouraging growth and responsibility, not simply providing whatever is demanded regardless of the consequences." As I spoke, I noticed my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. My father maintained his stoic expression, though his clasped hands tightened noticeably. Connor stared out the window, his jaw visibly tense. When I finished, Dr. Peterson thanked me for my candor and turned to my parents. "Sarah, David, what comes up for you as you listen to Olivia's perspective?" My mother spoke first, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "It's painful to hear how our parenting affected you, Olivia. We always believed we were responding to each of you according to your needs. You were so capable, so independent from a young age. Connor seemed to need more support, more protection." She paused, visibly struggling. "But Dr. Peterson has helped us see that what we thought was supporting Connor was actually holding him back from developing his own capabilities." My father cleared his throat. "I've always been proud of your self-reliance, Olivia. Perhaps too proud, to the point where I expected you to handle everything without help, while rushing to assist Connor with even minor challenges." He looked directly at me, his expression grave. "It wasn't fair to either of you. We set Connor up for dependency and you for perpetual self-sacrifice." Their acknowledgement was so unexpected, so contrary to decades of family patterns, that I temporarily lost my composure. Tears welled in my eyes as years of unspoken pain and frustration were finally validated. Dr. Peterson allowed a moment of silence before turning to Connor. "Connor, I know this is difficult. What are you hearing as your parents and sister speak?" Connor continued staring out the window for several seconds before finally turning toward us. His face reflected a complex mix of emotions: defensiveness, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "I don't know," he said finally. "Part of me wants to argue that everyone's exaggerating, that I'm not some helpless child who can't function without being rescued." He paused, fidgeting with his watch strap. "But another part knows there's truth here. When Olivia said no to giving me the condo, my first reaction wasn't to figure out an alternative. It was to get Mom and Dad to pressure her into changing her mind. That's not how a 30-year-old should handle problems." The admission, however qualified, represented a level of self-awareness I'd never witnessed from my brother before. Dr. Peterson nodded encouragingly. "That's an important recognition, Connor. It takes courage to acknowledge patterns that aren't serving us well. It's not just about the condo," he continued unexpectedly. "It's about everything. My whole life has been a series of bailouts. Whenever things get tough, someone always steps in to fix it. Usually Mom and Dad, sometimes Olivia, most recently Kira until she finally got fed up." He glanced at me briefly. "I found out Olivia ran into Kira at the farmer's market. I was angry at first, thinking they were conspiring against me. But what Kira told her was true. I did take advantage of her financially. I did expect her to solve my problems. And when she refused, I did try to make her feel like a horrible person for having boundaries. The room fell silent as we absorbed Connor's unprecedented candor. It wasn't a complete transformation. His tone still carried hints of self-pity, and his acknowledgement stopped short of full accountability. But it represented a significant departure from his usual denial and deflection. Dr. Peterson allowed the moment to breathe before responding. "Thank you for that honesty, Connor. Recognition is the first step toward change. And speaking of change, I understand there's been some movement regarding Olivia's condo?" Connor nodded. "I've agreed to Olivia's terms for a 6-month lease. It's fair. Actually, more than fair with the reduced initial rent. And I've started looking for work more seriously. Had 2 interviews last week." "That sounds like positive progress," Dr. Peterson observed. "Olivia, how do you feel about this potential arrangement?" I considered carefully before responding, not wanting to derail Connor's nascent accountability with either excessive skepticism or premature trust. "I'm cautiously optimistic," I said honestly. "The lease agreement provides structure and clear expectations, which I think will benefit both of us. I want to support Connor's independence, not enable dependency." "An important distinction," Dr. Peterson agreed. Which brings us to a crucial topic. Moving forward, how can this family support healthy independence for everyone while maintaining loving connections? What followed was the most honest conversation our family had ever experienced. My parents shared insights from their counseling sessions about how their different upbringings had influenced their parenting approaches. My father's strict, self-reliant childhood contrasted with my mother's experience as the fragile youngest daughter in a protective family. Connor spoke about the insecurity underlying his seeming confidence, the fear of failure that had led him to avoid real challenges in favor of grand but unsubstantiated plans. I discussed my complicated feelings of responsibility for family harmony and the exhaustion of being both the family achiever and emotional caretaker. Dr. Peterson guided us skillfully through these revelations, highlighting patterns, suggesting alternative perspectives, and gently challenging long-held assumptions. By the session's conclusion, we had not only gained greater understanding of our family dynamics, but had also established concrete agreements for moving forward. My parents committed to allowing Connor to experience natural consequences rather than rushing to rescue him from difficulties. Connor agreed to follow through with the condo lease agreement, including timely rent payments and proper property maintenance. I promised to communicate my boundaries clearly rather than silently, accommodating demands that felt unreasonable. Most importantly, we all agreed to continue our respective therapeutic work, my parents and Connor with Dr. Peterson, me with Dr. Abernathy, with occasional joint sessions to address family-wide issues. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Peterson offered a final observation. Family systems resist change, even positive change. There will be moments when old patterns reassert themselves, when the familiar feels safer than the new. When that happens, try to recognize it with compassion rather than judgment, then gently redirect toward the healthier patterns you're establishing. Outside in the parking lot, an awkward silence fell as we stood beside our respective cars. Years of family script had been disrupted, leaving us without clear direction for this moment. "Well," my mother finally said, her voice overly bright, "that was certainly productive. Perhaps we could all get lunch?" The suggestion was so characteristic of her approach, using social niceties to paper over emotional complexity, that I might have automatically agreed despite my own needs. Instead, I took a breath and practiced the direct communication we had just discussed. "I appreciate the invitation, Mom, but I need some time to process everything we talked about today. Maybe another time?" Her momentary look of disappointment was quickly replaced by understanding. "Of course, dear. It was a lot to take in. Maybe dinner later this week?" "I'd like that," I agreed, genuinely appreciating her respect for my boundary. My father, never comfortable with emotional situations, muttered something about a meeting and quickly retreated to their car. As my mother followed him, Connor lingered behind. "So," he said, hands in his pockets, "about the condo. When could I move in?" The immediate pivot to practical matters was so typical that I almost laughed. Some changes would come more gradually than others. "Let's finalize the lease agreement first," I suggested. "I'll email you the final version tomorrow. Once it's signed and the security deposit is paid, we can arrange the move-in." "Right, of course," he agreed with uncharacteristic amenability. "That makes sense." He hesitated, then added awkwardly, "And thanks. Not just for the condo, but for, not giving up on me completely." The statement was clumsy, but seemingly genuine. Perhaps the closest thing to gratitude I'd heard from Connor in years. "You're my brother," I said simply. "That doesn't mean I'll give you whatever you demand, but it does mean I want to see you thrive." As I drove home from the session, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary shifts that had occurred in just a few weeks. What had begun as a shocking demand for my property had catalyzed a fundamental re-examination of our entire family system. My initial refusal, a simple boundary protecting my financial security, had created space for everyone to recognize and begin addressing unhealthy patterns that had persisted for decades. True to Dr. Peterson's warning, the journey forward wasn't seamless. The following week brought both encouraging progress and frustrating regressions. Connor signed the lease agreement and paid the security deposit promptly, but then tried to negotiate move-in before the agreed start date. My mother caught herself rushing to solve a minor issue with Connor's car before stepping back to let him handle it himself. My father reverted briefly to silent disapproval when I declined a family gathering due to work commitments. Yet despite these occasional stumbles, the fundamental dynamic had shifted. When old patterns emerged, someone, sometimes my parents, occasionally even Connor, would recognize and redirect toward healthier interactions. We were developing a new vocabulary for our relationships, one that allowed for both independence and connection, for boundaries as well as support. 2 weeks after the joint therapy session, Connor moved into the condo. I met him there with keys and a simple welcome basket containing cleaning supplies, basic pantry staples, and a gift card to a nearby grocery store. As we completed the move-in inspection, noting the property's condition on the formal checklist, I was struck by how different this felt from our previous interactions. The clear structure of the landlord-tenant relationship paradoxically created space for our sibling relationship to exist separately, unburdened by financial entanglement. "I'll take good care of the place," Connor promised as we completed the paperwork. "I know my track record isn't great, but I'm really trying to do things differently now." "I believe you're trying," I said honestly, "and the agreement gives us both clarity about expectations, which helps." After he settled in, Connor surprised everyone by securing a job at a local marketing agency. Not a glamorous position, but a stable one with growth potential that utilized his creative talents. He began attending weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Peterson and joined a financial literacy course at the community college. The changes weren't dramatic or instantaneous, but they were real and sustained. My relationship with my parents evolved as well. Our interactions became more authentic, less burdened by unspoken expectations and assigned roles. My mother began asking about my needs and interests rather than focusing exclusively on Connor's latest crisis. My father expressed genuine curiosity about my work and occasionally sought my advice on matters unrelated to real estate. We were learning to see each other as complex individuals rather than as fixed characters in a family drama. 6 months after Connor's initial demand, as his reduced rent period at the condo was concluding, we met for coffee to discuss next steps. He had maintained perfect payment history and taken good care of the property, a significant departure from his previous patterns. "I've been thinking about the lease extension," he began, surprising me by raising the topic himself. I know we discussed the possibility if things went well during the initial 6 months. Yes, I agreed cautiously. Things have gone very well from my perspective. You've been a model tenant. He smiled slightly at the formal designation. I've appreciated the opportunity, and the stability has helped me focus on other areas: the job, therapy, getting my finances in order. He hesitated briefly. That said, I've been looking at other rental options recently. Oh? I tried to keep the surprise from my voice. I had assumed he would want to extend the discounted arrangement as long as possible. Yeah, there's an apartment complex closer to my office. The units are smaller than the condo, but the location would save me commuting time, and... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think it might be good for us to separate the sibling relationship from the landlord-tenant one. Not immediately, but eventually. The maturity of this perspective was so unexpected that it momentarily left me speechless. Connor had identified a potential conflict I'd been concerned about but hadn't voiced: the complicated dynamics of maintaining both familial and financial relationships long-term. I think that's very insightful, I said finally. Though I'm happy to extend the lease if the timing isn't right for a move yet. I appreciate that. Actually, I was thinking about a modified arrangement. If you're willing to extend for 3 more months at the current rate, that would give me time to save a proper security deposit for the new place and make the transition without financial strain. We discussed the details, eventually agreeing to a 3-month extension with a clear end date. As we were preparing to leave, Connor said something that captured the profound shift in our relationship. You know, when you refused to give me the condo, I was convinced you were being selfish and uncaring. I told everyone who would listen what a terrible sister you were. He shook his head ruefully. But looking back, your no was probably the most helpful thing anyone's done for me in years. It forced me to confront patterns I'd been comfortably ignoring. It wasn't easy to maintain that boundary, I admitted, especially with the family pressure. I know, and I'm sorry for my role in that pressure. But I'm grateful you held firm. He met my eyes directly. You could have given me what I demanded, and I would have temporarily felt better, but I wouldn't have grown. Sometimes the most supportive thing isn't giving people what they ask for, it's giving them what they actually need. His words stayed with me long after we parted. Connor had articulated something profound about true support, a principle that applied far beyond our specific situation. By refusing his unreasonable demand and instead offering structured, appropriate assistance, I had ultimately provided something far more valuable than property, an opportunity for genuine growth and independence. The journey hadn't been easy for any of us. There had been painful confrontations, difficult revelations, and moments of doubt. My parents were still learning to differentiate between supportive parenting and enabling dependency. Connor still occasionally slipped into victim narratives when faced with challenges. I still sometimes struggled with establishing boundaries without guilt, but we were moving forward with greater awareness and intention. The family system that had once seemed immutable had proven capable of evolution. Patterns established over decades had begun to shift, creating space for more authentic connections and healthier independence. 3 months later, I helped Connor move into his new apartment, a modest but well-maintained 1-bedroom in a complex near his office. As we carried the last box up the stairs, he surveyed the space with evident pride. It's not fancy, he acknowledged, but it's mine. Earned through my own work, maintained through my own responsibility. It suits you, I observed, noting the natural light that would complement his artistic sensibilities. And you've done well to find something affordable in this location. Had to compromise on square footage, but the shorter commute is worth it. He arranged a row of houseplants along the windowsill, a new interest he'd developed while at the condo. Plus, I'm learning that I don't need as much space as I thought. Less to clean, less to fill with stuff I don't need. The philosophy represented such a departure from his previous materialistic focus that I couldn't help but smile. As we unpacked kitchen essentials, Connor shared news about a promotion at work, the financial goals he was setting with his therapists, guidance, and plans to take a photography course at the community college. My phone buzzed with a text from my real estate agent. New tenant application for the condo looks promising. Professional couple, excellent references, 2-year lease interest. The timing couldn't have been better. The rental market had improved significantly since Connor had first moved in, and a 2-year tenant would provide welcome stability. I showed Connor the message. "Looks like the condo won't be vacant long," I observed. "Good," he said sincerely. "That place deserves responsible tenants." He paused, then added with a hint of his old humor, "Though I doubt they'll appreciate that squeaky floorboard in the hallway as much as I did. Perfect for checking if someone's approaching when you're raiding the refrigerator at midnight." We shared a laugh, then continued unpacking in comfortable silence. The afternoon unfolded with an easy camaraderie I couldn't remember experiencing. With Connor before, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than habitual roles or financial entanglement. As I prepared to leave, Connor handed me a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "Just a thank you," he explained awkwardly. "For everything." Inside was a framed photograph he had taken of my house during golden hour. The stained glass, window inserts capturing the late afternoon light in vibrant colors. The composition was artful, the perspective unique. He had clearly taken time and care with the image. "Connor, this is beautiful," I said, genuinely moved by both the gesture and his talent. "Just wanted you to have something that represented. I don't know, that I see your home as yours, that I respect what you've built." The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it was sincere, an acknowledgement of how far we had come from his entitled demand of 9 months earlier. In that moment, I felt profound gratitude for the difficult boundary I had maintained despite intense pressure. By refusing to give Connor what he wanted, I had created space for him to discover what he truly needed. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the extraordinary journey our family had undertaken. What had begun with an outrageous demand had catalyzed transformation none of us could have anticipated. By making that difficult phone call to Dr. Abernathy, rather than capitulating to preserve artificial harmony, I had set in motion a process that ultimately benefited everyone. Not just myself, but Connor, my parents, and our family system as a whole. The experience had taught me that sometimes the most loving response isn't automatic accommodation, but thoughtful boundaries. That family support means encouraging growth rather than enabling dependency. That meaningful change often begins with a single courageous no, when every familiar pattern pushes for an easy yes. Most importantly, I had learned that transforming relationship patterns requires patience, consistency, and compassion, both for others and for ourselves. Change rarely follows a linear path. It emerges gradually through small, sustained choices that affirm healthier ways of connecting and supporting each other. As I pulled into my driveway and gazed at my home, the home I had worked so hard to create and protect, I felt a quiet pride in the boundaries I had established and the growth those boundaries had ultimately fostered. The journey wasn't complete. Family healing rarely is. But we were moving forward together, with greater awareness and intention than ever before. And it had all begun with that pivotal moment when I decided that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for those we care about is to stand firmly in our own truth, even when that truth disrupts comfortable patterns. The call that changed everything wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about creating space for authentic relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or dependency. That call had indeed changed everything in ways none of us could have imagined. 1 year after Connor's initial demand, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have predicted. The ripple effects of that single boundary-setting moment had extended far beyond my immediate family relationships, influencing my professional decisions, social connections, and sense of self in profound and unexpected ways. Spring had arrived, with particular vibrancy that year. My garden beds burst with color, daffodils, tulips, and hyacinths I'd planted the previous fall as a symbolic investment in my future. As I tended to the new growth one Saturday morning, my neighbor Julia called over the fence, "Those flowers are magnificent, Olivia. You've really transformed this place." I smiled, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "Thanks. It's been a labor of love." "Speaking of transformations," Julia continued, "I wanted to tell you how much your advice helped with my situation at work. I finally had that conversation with my department head about the project reassignment." 2 months earlier, Julia had shared her frustration about a major project being reassigned to a less experienced colleague without explanation. She'd been hesitant to address it directly, fearing she would appear difficult or ungrateful for her position. Our conversation on my back patio had stretched late into the evening as I shared insights from my own journey in setting boundaries and advocating for myself. "How did it go?" I asked, genuinely interested. "Better than I expected," Julia admitted. "I used that approach you suggested, focusing on my qualifications and contributions rather than emotional reactions. He actually hadn't realized how the reassignment appeared from my perspective. I've been restored as project lead, with additional resources." "That's wonderful," I said, truly pleased for her success. "I keep thinking about something you said that night," Julia reflected. "Appropriate boundaries aren't just about saying no to others. They're about saying yes to yourself." That really shifted my thinking. Her words gave me pause. I had indeed shared that perspective, though I hadn't fully appreciated its significance until faced with Connor's demand. The boundary I'd established had been as much about affirming my own worth as it had been about refusing his unreasonable request. "I'm glad it was helpful," I replied. "It took me years to learn that lesson." "Well, you're a natural mentor," Julia said with a smile. "Have you ever thought about sharing these insights more broadly? The Women's Leadership Network at my company is always looking for speakers on professional development topics." The suggestion caught me off guard. I had never considered myself qualified to guide others on personal boundaries or professional advocacy. Those were skills I'd developed through necessity rather than expertise. "I'm hardly an expert," I demurred. "I'm still learning myself." "That's exactly what makes your perspective valuable," Julia countered. "You speak from authentic experience, not abstract theory. Just think about it. Our quarterly forum is coming up in May." I promised to consider it, though I still felt uncertain about positioning myself as any kind of authority on the subject. As Julia returned to her yard, I continued gardening, mulling over her surprising suggestion. Later that afternoon, I received an email from my real estate agent, Margot. "Condo tenants signed renewal for second year. All inspections excellent. Property value up 12% since last assessment. Ready to discuss next investment opportunity when you are." The message brought a smile of satisfaction. The professional couple renting my condo had proven to be ideal tenants, responsible, communicative, and respectful of the property. Their decision to renew for a second year provided welcome stability for my investment portfolio. More significantly, the email reminded me how differently this scenario had unfolded from what Connor had demanded. Had I surrendered to family pressure and given him the property, I would have lost not only a valuable asset, but also the opportunity to establish a healthy professional arrangement with reliable tenants. Instead, both Connor and I had benefited. From the boundary I'd maintained, he had developed greater independence and financial responsibility, while I had preserved my investment and expanded my options for the future. That evening, I scheduled a consultation with Margot to discuss potential next steps. The substantial increase in my property values, combined with my solid credit history and career advancement, positioned me to consider opportunities I might not have imagined a year earlier. While I wasn't ready to commit to another purchase immediately, I wanted to explore possibilities for diversifying my real estate investments. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a text message from Connor. Just got the news. Photography selected for community showcase next month. First time showing work publicly. Terrifying, but exciting. Let me know if you'd be interested in coming. The invitation represented another milestone in our evolving relationship. Connor sharing an achievement without minimizing its significance, or couching it in self-deprecation, was notably different from his previous pattern. More striking still was his straightforward invitation. Not presumptuous, not manipulative, just a simple expression of interest in having me present for something important to him. I replied with genuine enthusiasm. Congratulations. That's a significant recognition of your talent. I'd love to attend the showcase. Please send details when you have them. His response came quickly. Will do. Working on a new series this weekend. Learning a lot about composition and patience. The brief exchange highlighted how our communication had evolved. Gone were the subtle guilt trips, the implicit expectations, the undercurrent of competition that had characterized so many of our interactions throughout adulthood. In their place was emerging a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's lives. Sunday morning brought another unexpected development. I opened my email to find a message from Aunt Sharon with the subject line, "Opportunity to consider." Inside was a link to a property listing with a brief note. Noticed this while researching investment options for my retirement portfolio. Might interest you given your long-term goals. No pressure, just thought I'd share. Having lunch with a realtor friend Tuesday if you want more information. The property was a small mixed-use building downtown, 2 commercial spaces on the ground floor with 4 residential units above. Currently fully occupied with established tenants, it represented a different type of real estate investment than my existing properties. The location was excellent, positioned in a neighborhood experiencing revitalization without the displacement concerns affecting other areas of the city. Aunt Sharon and I had maintained regular contact since the family breakthrough, occasionally meeting for lunch or attending community events together. She had become something of a mentor figure, offering perspective from her own experiences navigating family dynamics and building financial independence. This property recommendation represented a new dimension to our relationship. Professional collaboration based on shared interests and mutual respect. I forwarded the listing to Margot with a request for her assessment, then responded to Aunt Sharon expressing interest in learning more over lunch. The potential investment was exciting, but equally significant was the expanding network of supportive relationships that had developed in the wake of my boundary-setting journey. Monday morning at work brought its own developments. My team had recently completed a major marketing campaign for our largest client, exceeding performance metrics across all channels. The success had raised my profile within the company, leading to an unexpected meeting request from the CEO. "Olivia," she began as I settled into a chair across from her desk, "the executive team has been impressed with your leadership on the Westfield campaign. The client specifically mentioned your strategic vision in their feedback." "That's very kind," I replied. "It was truly a team effort. Everyone contributed exceptional work. Your ability to coordinate those contributions was key," she countered. "Which brings me to the purpose of this meeting. We're creating a new position, Director of Strategic Initiatives, to oversee cross-departmental projects with our most significant clients. Your name is at the top of our consideration list." The opportunity was substantial, a senior leadership role with expanded responsibilities, increased compensation, and greater influence on company direction. It represented precisely the type of advancement I had been working toward for years. "I'm honored to be considered," I said, genuine enthusiasm mixing with a touch of caution. "Could you tell me more about what this role would entail?" As the CEO outlined the position, I found myself evaluating it not just for professional advancement, but also for alignment with my personal values and boundaries. The role would require significant time investment and emotional energy, resources I had become more intentional about allocating since my experience with Connor. "This sounds like an exciting opportunity," I acknowledged when she finished. "I'd like to take some time to consider it carefully and perhaps discuss some specific aspects of the role before making a decision. Would that be possible?" A year. Earlier, I might have accepted immediately, eager to prove my value and meet expectations regardless of personal cost. My journey in boundary setting had taught me to pause and evaluate opportunities against my own priorities, rather than simply responding to external validation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.